Welcome to Science Frontiers, a space for discussions in the frontier areas of science, technology, and society. I'm your host, Vinay Panda. The work of scientists is seen by their peers and world at large through their research papers, which form a dominant part of the scientist's output. The process of getting research papers published goes like this. Scientists, and I'm primarily talking about those who are funded by taxpayers' money and work in public and private higher education and research institutions like universities, write research grants which are judged by the other experts in the same field. Once selected, scientists get money, which is spent in buying equipment and reagents, pay personnel like junior researchers and students who do most of the work. And finally, when the work is ready for publishing, scientists send their work to academic journals, which are run both by commercial and society publishers to get their work published. Ideally, one would expect that the same taxpayers who have paid for the researchers to start with, both for their work and their salary, especially those who work in public institutions, will get to see the research papers for free. But this doesn't happen. Publishers usually put the research papers behind paywall and charge everyone either through journal subscriptions or charge to access individual articles published in those journals. The worst part of the system is that publishers who make billions of dollars in revenue and profit and who claim complete copyright over the researchers' published articles charge the same researchers hefty fees to access the articles. Therefore, the field of scholarly publishing is neither fair nor right. This harms everyone. To talk about how scholarly publishing works and how we can collectively make amends to the process, we have a very special guest today, Michael Eisen. Mike is a Howard Hughes Medical Institute investigator and a professor of genetics, genomics, and development at the University of California at Berkeley, and has been a leading crusader on the issue getting scholarly publishing right. Mike, welcome to the forum, and thank you for joining.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with some background. How did we get into this mess to start with? I mean, can you tell our viewers, how did it all start? How did the publishers who did not fund the research, did not do the research, did not analyze the data, did not write the papers, did not review the papers, did not do literally anything except chasing other scientists to do some of their own work, which anyway they were doing, had gained complete control over the published literature? I mean, in any other industry, this would be considered insane. Still, here we are, supposedly one of the highly educated, our citizens, us, the scientists, give away most of our rights to publishers. Why? Why this insanity? Give our viewers some of the background. How did we get in here and how did you land up in this mess to start with?
Right. So, a good question and a complicated one, but I think there's some simple things you can say. So first of all, if you think about the history of science publishing, right, of course, the system that we have today dates back to the pre-internet era. And, before the internet came along, a scientist who wanted to share their work with their colleagues faced primarily a technological hurdle or, a communications technology hurdle. In that, if I wrote a paper describing, the work I was doing from the University of California, and I wanted scientists across the world to be able to read about what I'd done, somebody had to print, copies of my article. Somebody had to mail them to other places around the world where, either individual scientists or groups of scientists would want to access that work. And obviously that, the two things you needed to take advantage of there were the printing press and the postal service, both of which cost money, right? It costs money to print copies of journals, and it costs money to mail them around the world. And so, just like in other areas of publishing at the time, a business evolved around it, or a business model evolved around publishing, in which publishers, spun up journals, and there were, already by the end of the 19th century, many journals in different fields run by both societies and commercial publishers even then. And, their core business was to try to match authors with readers. And so, they set up their systems in different ways, but the basic model was you had um, some way of deciding which papers were going to be printed, right? It costs money to print them and mail them. So the journal had some role in deciding which papers to print and send around the world. And they had some, potential readers. And obviously it made the most sense to distribute the cost amongst the readers rather than charge the authors for producing their work, just because kind of from a business perspective and an economic perspective that made sense. And there were really two models for how to decide what papers to produce. You had the kind of society membership model that was originally pioneered by the Royal Society in the 17th century, in which you had members of an organization, and if you were a member of the organization, it was presumed that other members of the organization would want to read your work. And so the system was set up so that if you were elected a member of this group, the Royal Society or whatever group you were talking about, it was presumed that you could submit papers to the journal, and then they would be sent around to the other members, and the members would pay some fee or for their membership that would cover the operations of the journal and so forth. It kind of made sense, right? Like you had a sane, economics, and importantly, the economics of distribution in that system scaled with the number of readers. Every reader really was, cost you more money because you had to print and mail an extra copy of the journal. And so the economic system made sense. It wasn't exactly fair because, people around, people who weren't members or who didn't have money to subscribe would have difficulty accessing the journals, and, libraries at universities subscribed in lieu of individuals so that people could get access to it. And there was some system to make sure that at least the people who were practicing scientists at universities that had money could get access to the scientific literature and so forth. I mean, obviously, even back then, there were inequalities. So my grandfather was a physicist, and I remember as a child, he would take the journals that he got as part of his work, and after he was done reading them, he would package them up and send them to scientists he was in touch with in places where they couldn't afford them. Some of them I remember him sending them to Poland because he had colleagues in Poland where his family had originally been from, who were scientists, and then also in Cuba, where the Cuban government didn't have a lot of money to subscribe to journals, and there were scientists there were didn't have access to the latest science. So the only way for them to get it was for people to send them copies of their journals. Okay, so unfair system, but kind of probably the best you could do given the limits of the technology. I should also say another model arose during the 19th century, which was not a membership journal per se, but a straight up subscription journal, where the journal, rather than deciding based on membership in a society who would be able to publish, they actually just, people sent them papers, and if they thought that their readers would be interested, they would send them to them. They would accept them to the journal and send them off to their readers. And so you kind of had this evolution of commercially directed publishing even then, where people looked at publishing as a business, a for-profit business, that if you could get scientists to send you the best papers and you could get people to subscribe to your journal, you could make money that way. So all of that happened, even before the change in the internet. Some publishers started to realize that they had scientists over the barrel a little bit here, in the sense that, if you're a scientist, you have to read papers, right? It's the way we do science. And if a journal controls the papers that a scientist is interested in, then in principle, the journal can charge whatever they want to get access to it. If your life's work depends upon getting access to a particular journal, and they increase their prices by 25% or 50% or whatever they want, assuming you actually have the money, which isn't always the case, but if you have the money, you're going to pay. And so in the kind of post World War II era, science funding grew. Publishers started to see just a really lucrative business in spinning up new journals, attracting content to those journals, and then effectively charging whatever they wanted for them. And that was assisted by the fact that increasingly the subscriptions were being paid by libraries. And so the authors were insulated from the costs. They didn't see them. The library was paying for the subscriptions. And so the authors who were deciding what journals would get their papers and were making decisions in a way that had very little to do with the economics of the journal. And they were basing their decisions based on what journal would look best for them on their CVs. And so, publishers realized they had this really great little game going where they could give something to scientists, prestige citations on their CVs, that really cost them nothing to provide, cost the publishers nothing to provide, while at the same time attracting lots of really important content, and then basically having a monopoly control over the papers that they published, and therefore selling them back to libraries. So even before the internet came along, librarians had been raising the alarm about this scholarly publishing crisis where escalating charges were the norm, and journals were basically like, I don't think there's any other kind way to say it. They were kind of stealing money from science by exploiting monopoly control over publishing. I have trained at wealthy institutions my whole life, so I never really experienced the challenge of not having access to the latest literature. But my mother, who was a teacher at a community college and with basically no research library, couldn't get access to papers, including papers that she had published in her research career. Like, you could see, even in the United States, where we had lots of money going into science, there was a tremendous amount of inequality in access to the literature already before any of the technology changed. Absolutely. But of course, mid 1990s, the technology completely changed. Science publishing was one of the first businesses to go online, because early in the internet, it was academics who had the best access to internet connections, right? We had fast internet at the university, we had computers to access the internet on, before the world as a whole really got access to the internet. We had good access to the internet at universities. And so in the mid 1990s, as the internet sort of took off, academic publishers were amongst the first entities to go online. And obviously, like, the potential for the internet to change the way scientists communicate was sitting there right in front of us. Honestly, if you look back at the history of the internet, right, the first development of the internet was explicitly in order to enable scientists to communicate with each other, right? The first nodes of the internet were at universities, and the idea was to come up with a way for them to share data and findings as fast as possible. Now, it was funded by the Defense Department, and their motivation was to help military research, not molecular biology. But they realized that electronic, high-speed electronic communications could really transform the way that scientists communicated, and therefore the way that science works. So, we had this opportunity, right? You went from a world where basic technology was what limited the ability to share scientists with anybody in the world. Like, if you lived in a rural community in Uganda that didn't have a library and you wanted to access scientific literature, you couldn't. But it was really a technology problem that restricted that. It wasn't feasible for someone to print and mail a copy of every scientific paper to everybody on the planet. It just would have cost too much and wasn't possible. But with the internet, that all of a sudden became possible. there was absolutely no reason why we couldn't have taken, at the time the internet was born, the entire scientific literature, put it online, and made it available to anyone in the world for free, in a historical sense and in a forward-looking sense. That was why it was created. It was a possibility that the technology allowed, and the fact that we didn't do it was it's just a scandal, right? Like, we had, if the, you started out talking about publicly funded science, right? If we couldn't figure out a way to take a publicly created good, the scientific literature, and share it with the world, I mean, it's, we obviously didn't deserve the internet. I mean, it is what the internet was created for. It's what it should have enabled. But unfortunately, the internet came along at a time when science publishing was a many billion-dollar business. And instead of taking advantage of the new technology to make the scientific literature more widely available and more democratic and share it across the world, the publishers just basically said, hey, we've got a really great business here. Let's just get rid of all of our costs, printing and shipping, and yet keep the same business model, the same business model that made sense in the past. It doesn't make sense in the internet, and that's where we are today.
Thanks. And I think there are two take-home messages from your answer. Number one, that in old time, pre-internet, there was some smart-ass publishers who thought, you know what, this is the time to make money. Great. But at the same time, since mid-90s, as you told you 25 years back, we cannot only blame the publishers because there was internet. So it is scientists to blame. And I want to come back to that question again, because some of your writings you have clearly mentioned, and I totally agree with that we cannot shy away from taking responsibility as the group.
Right. So I think one of the big questions is, why did we let the publishers do this? Right. Exactly. So we let the publishers get away with this. Like, there's nothing that requires that we send our papers to journals that use business practices that are bad for the internet. It's not like nobody proposed alternatives, right? Like, I was involved tangentially with a move way back in 1998. Right?
If you hold on to that thought, I'm coming to that question, and I'll get back to the.
Sure.
So, this is a great segue to get back, to the history, and the history which is your own history, and this is the question that relates to when you were a postdoctoral fellow in Pat Brown's lab in Stanford in 1998. You wanted to use the digital repository in the Highware Press, and you were surprised that you couldn't. And you, along with the other mentor, Harold Damas, who was then the head of NIH, who started an initiative called eBiomed. Now, take us through the journey, what exactly happened then, and also tell us, which is more surprising, that why did such a fantastic initiative like eBiomed die? And that actually gave rise to the initiative that you started, which is, we know as Public Library of Science, or PLOS. So take us through that journey.
Right. So So mid 1990s. I finished my PhD in 1996. The internet was sort of a thing already by then, but not like a big cultural phenomenon. It was something we used in our work. I mean, I got access to data and things like that, but not papers, right? Like scientific papers, through my PhD, I accessed scientific literature entirely in printed journals. I had stacks of photocopied papers and things like that. That's how I accessed the literature. I did my PhD on influenza viruses, and I had a stack of papers, if I can get this into the screen, maybe half a meter tall. That was, all the papers, basically all the papers that I could access on the gene that I was studying. And I had, in my brain, at least, some reasonable knowledge of that literature. And that's how I did my science. I knew the literature, I read it, I printed it out, I had printed copies of the papers. I worked on one gene, so it was possible for me to know the literature on that gene. It was a reasonably obscure gene too, so it wasn't that much to know. And then I shifted from work on one protein to going as a postdoc in Pat Brown and David Botstein's lab to working on at the beginning of the genomics era. So I happened to start my postdoc at a time when two big things were happening: the rise of genomic science in biology and the rise of the internet. And the work we were doing, its fundamental characteristic was we were doing experiments on entire genomes worth of genes instead of one gene at a time. So the two kind of big sets of experiments I was involved in as a postdoc were, measuring gene expression of every gene in the yeast genome, 6,000 genes in the yeast genome, across a wide variety of life conditions for yeast cells, and then doing the same in human cells and human tissues in various normal and disease processes. So I went from working on something where I could know the entire literature of one gene and bring that literature to bear in my research and my writing, to a situation where that was completely impossible, right? When I'm looking even at a simple organism like yeast, there were tens of thousands of papers that had been written describing the behavior of individual genes and systems of genes in yeast at the time we were doing this work. There was no way I could read or know about that entire collection of hang on one second, Septan, so my way. That entire collection of literature. And so coincidentally and conveniently, at exactly that time, the scientific journals were putting their content online in a digital form. They were taking these printed papers and putting them making them available in an electronic form. And also coincidentally and fortunately, the place where a lot of that was happening was about a kilometer away from our. I'm switching to non-American units here, so I think it's a kilometer away from where our lab was. And I was a computer programmer and I was working on analyzing data, and it seemed obvious to me and to Pat, who I was working closely with on all of this, that if we could get the electronic copies of all those papers that were describing yeast genes, and we combined that with the experimental data that was coming out of the lab, that we could make sense of the data in a much more efficient and comprehensive manner. So we went down to the library. Pat set up an appointment with the head of the Highwire Press, and we told him what we wanted to do. We showed up with a disc, like a physical disc, and we basically said, can you just give us all these papers and put them on this disc so we can go do our science better? It seemed like a no-brainer. Like, it literally did not occur to me that the answer would be no. I mean, my biggest concern was whether it would fit on the disc that we were bringing, not whether or not it was going to be permissible. And honestly, like the guy just laughed at us, like not like not like in a mean way. He's just like, no, those papers don't belong to science. They belong to the journals, and the journals don't want to give it away for free. They want to sell it. And so we were flat out turned down for doing what we wanted to do. Now, maybe it wouldn't have worked. Maybe we were naive about how we would do the experiments. But the idea that this publicly created body of literature, whose sole purpose, really, its creation was to help humanity understand the world and to make a better universe. And the idea that literature would not be made available to us now that the technology allowed it, right? The technology clearly allowed us to take that stuff away and go work on it. And the fact that it was not being made available to us because of something that literally I'd never thought of once in my life before that point, which was that the process of science publishing demanded, in the way it was set up, that scientists give the papers to the journals. The journals now own the scientific literature. And, I came away from that meeting kind of, just, I don't know, like my eyes opened, but also mostly dispirited. But Pat came away from that meeting really pissed off. And he instead of, like just saying, well, that's a bummer, we'll go back and figure out some other way to do this kind of work. Pat said, well, this is stupid. The system is like the system. If the system is designed in a way to make sure that we can't get access to the literature, the system is stupid and needs to change. And so Pat began, a real crusade to try to convince people that the system needed to change. And the amazing thing is everybody agrees. Like there's nobody who thinks the current system is rational, even back then. And yet it was incredibly difficult to get anybody to do anything about it. And fortunately, Pat knew Harold Varmus from they had worked together when Pat was a postdoc, and he knew Harold, and Harold was in the exactly right position to affect change as director of the NIH. And Pat and Harold had coffee somewhere in San Francisco, and Pat basically laid out the problem to Harold, who immediately saw the problem and the solution, and immediately realized that the NIH could have played a really fundamental role in reshaping this by basically creating a giant free and open archive of the published biomedical literature. It was inspired by the fact that physicists had been doing this for a decade at this point in their own online archive of the physics literature. And the basic idea was, well, physics isn't suffering for making all of its literature freely available. Indeed, it's thriving. So why, like the NIH is funding all this research in the United States. What better purpose for the NIH to pursue and to use this National Library of Medicine that it created to create basically a national digital library of medicine, something that I'll say still does not exist because of the failure of this venture. So he proposed something, eBiomed, as you said, which would have been that. It was a little complex around the edges, but the basic idea was the NIH would operate a giant server where anybody who had a work of science to share would be able to share it for free, and anybody could access it and read it and use it and download it and compute on it or whatever else you wanted to do with it. And then journals, such as they would continue to exist in the system, wouldn't be publishers. They would be reviewing the literature and adding value if they could add value to the literature that was freely available. It wasn't a visionary proposal. It would have fundamentally changed science. I think if the NIH had done it, everybody else in the world probably would have followed suit, and I think it would have become the norm for all at least biomedical research. But the publishers who were had a lot of income from their existing businesses and therefore a lot of influence were successful in getting this killed. And they lobbied Congress, and Congress said, we're not going to fund something that's undermining these important vital businesses, for science. And they killed it, and it became something much less valuable, which was what PubMed Central, which exists today, which had the same ambitions, but participation was voluntary. Unlike in the eBiomed model, where any NIH-funded research would have been kind of obligated to go into eBiomed, it became something that journals had to volunteer to participate in, and obviously they didn't. So it's by and large, some did, but by and large they didn't participate, and so as it was the failure of publishing and the failure of science to embrace the idea that the entire scientific literature should be open that ultimately led Pat and me and Harold to start the Public Library of Science. So I guess I'll pause there since I keep talking.
Exactly. So I think it's great that we all agree that despite every scientist agrees what you just said and we talked about, but still we do not have a solution. And in fact, to me personally, the really hard blow was 2013, because even a suicide of a prodigy like Aaron Schwartz could not change anything. We all have gone into trauma when that happened. and I can talk about myself personally, but that didn't change the behavior of scientists. And you have been very critical about scientists' behavior. And I'm just wondering, what do you think why scientists actually don't want to change for something which is essentially good for science, good for humanity, and good for their own career?
Yeah, I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I would have solved the problem before. I mean, I think the superficial answer is that um, that that they feel that. I mean, the generous answer is that they feel that they're forced to choose between what they're being told is good for their careers and what is good for science. And I think that there's the publishers have set up this this choice that they've made this illusion of choice that in order to succeed as a scientist you have to publish in the most prominent journals. People believe that. They believe it in a lot of different contexts, despite I would say a kind of lack of any really good evidence to support this hypothesis. That I think that basically we in the modern world people are choosing their own careers over what's good for science. I mean, I'm not trying to make a moral argument out of that. It's just an observation that basically people's behavior is dominated by decisions that advance their own that they feel advance their own careers and interests. And so it's become a serious serious conundrum, I think, in the world. And I'll say I don't buy that hypothesis, like the idea that this is true. I think people vastly overestimate the influence that journals play in their career success. Even people attribute it, people who are successful scientists believe that they're successful because they publish their papers in the right places, not because they did important science. And I'd say, also our institutions, by and large, reinforce that idea rather than fight against it. It's very few scientific institutions that have fought hard against the idea that they're judging people based on science. They say things, they say the right things. They say we judge on science, not on journals. But in practice, they promote or at least allow an evaluation system to persist in which people equate the place of publication with the importance of the work, even though we know that that's just a completely false notion, right? We know well that the best science is not always published in the best journals. Right. That the most impactful science is often often not appreciated at the time. Its value and its durability isn't appreciated in favor of what drives science publishing. So everybody not only knows that the system is bad in terms of how it provides access to people, they also know it's bad in terms of its cost, right? Like the fact that it's a $10 billion a year expense for science is just ludicrous, right? Given how tight funding is. But actually, people know that it doesn't even do a good job of what it purports to do, which is to identify important science and tell us what it's important for us to read and who's doing good work. It doesn't even do that well. And so we continue to allow this to happen. I was back in the 90s, I believed that all the people who said, well, I have to get my career established, and once I'm in positions of power, I'll change the system. But those people are now in positions of power and aren't changing the system. So this idea that like there's some future world in which we can play the game until we're successful, and then all of a sudden we'll change things, just is false. It doesn't happen. And people whether they want to kind of admit it or not, they're creating by their own choices a scientific system that is bad. It's bad for everybody, and there's no other kind way to say it. Like, if we want to change the system, we have to change the system, not hope someone else is going to do it for us.
Absolutely, I can't agree with you more.